Hi everyone. Today I am going to take you through a case study that happened at St. Regis School. So first, let's review a little of the information about the situation. There is Mrs. Lynn, who is the library media specialist, and she's also taking on the role of computer lab teacher. The principal, Mr. Sample, and those two have been working together to implement new software programs to support the instructional objectives at St. Regis School. Mrs. Lynn recently ordered new software programs for use in the school computer lab by the teachers and their students. And then the teachers approach Mrs. Lynn and ask her to make copies of the software programs for use on the computers in their individual classrooms. So Mrs. Lynn agrees and makes multiple copies of the software programs without permission from the author or the publisher. And then Mrs. Lynn distributes the copies to Mrs. Williams and Mrs. Brandon, as well as some of the other grade level teachers at the school. So Mrs. Williams, who is an experienced teacher at St. Regis, she gladly accepts the copies. Mrs. Brandon is a new teacher to St. Regis, but she does have prior experience at another school. She explains her concern about copyright violation and states that teachers were not allowed to make copies of computer programs at her other school. Now, Mrs. Lynn, thinking that she is doing something to help out the school, she is not very happy with Mrs. Brandon's response. So then Mrs. Brandon approaches Mr. Sample to share her concerns. Mr. Sample is aware that Mrs. Lynn is in violation of the copyright laws and shares this with Mrs. Lynn. He also instructs her to collect all the copies that have been made and to not make any additional copies in the future. Mrs. Lynn, again, she's thinking, she is doing something to help out the school. She becomes argumentative and shares that Mrs. Evans, who is the PTA president, also helped in making the copies. So now let's think about the legal and ethical issues of the situation. Mrs. Lynn has put St. Regis School, the district, teachers, students, principal, and PTA president at risk for serious consequences for violation of copyright laws. Mr. Sample and Mrs. Brandon are aware that Mrs. Lynn's actions are in violation of the copyright laws. And according to the law, you may not network software unless it is licensed for networking. So Mrs. Lynn has violated the 1976 U.S. Copyright Act as well as its 1980 amendment. In this situation, we are unaware of St. Regis and the district's exact policies on copyright or if they have an acceptable use policy, but if they have anything in their school board policies, then Mrs. Lynn would also be in violation of her contract. So a quick summary of the situation. Mrs. Lynn is in violation of copyright law and has put her school, school district, teachers, students, administrator, and PTA president at risk for consequences due to making copies of computer software programs and distributing them to teachers at her school without permission from the author and/or the publisher. So the following people, place, and program are affected. The people involved are Mrs. Lynn, she's the primary person in violation. Mr. Sample and Mrs. Brandon are aware of Mrs. Lynn's actions and knows that the actions violate the copyright laws. Mrs. Williams, Mrs. Brandon, and other second, third, and fourth grade teachers have received the copies of the software programs. Mrs. Evans, who is the PTA president, helped Mrs. Lynn make the copies. And in this situation, it is unknown how many teachers and students actually use the copies in their own individual classrooms. This all took place at St. Regis School, which is a school located in a rural area about 25 miles from a larger city. A little bit more information about the school. They serve grades kindergarten through 8th grade. There are approximately 420 students with 2 teachers in each grade level and 2 special education teachers for the building. Their financial support comes from state allocation and 2 yearly fundraisers, one in the fall, one in the spring. So the school's budget covers basic materials for the teachers, and the small extra amount is dedicated to purchasing new computer softwares. So let's talk a little bit about how this could impact the stakeholders. This situation is putting all stakeholders at risk for serious consequences. And the stakeholders include the school, the district, administrator, teachers, PTA, students, and also the community. Mrs. Lynn needs to stop making the copies and collect all the copies that have been distributed immediately. It would be important for teachers to remove the software from individual computers and stop student use immediately. Mr. Sample needs to follow up and make sure these actions have been taken. He should also investigate how many teachers and students have used the software for individual use. Mrs. Brandon has taken the appropriate action by alerting her superior, Mr. Sample, and she should also follow up and make sure actions are being taken to remedy the situation. It would be helpful to know the school and also the district's policies on copyright, and if they have an acceptable use policy. We are unaware of the exact policies and if any training has been received on copyright. So in this situation, we have a few options for how this can be handled. Option 1 would be for Mr. Sample to leave the situation as is. He's instructed Mrs. Lynn to stop making the copies and collect the copies that have been made. And at this point, he could do no further investigation to see how far the distribution has gone. Now, this option, it kind of lets Mrs. Lynn gets off with a warning, and there's no follow through to make sure that Mrs. Lynn is actually following Mr. Sample's instruction. Therefore, the stakeholders are still at risk for consequences later down the line. Option 1 is assuming that Mrs. Lynn will not be caught, but taking no further action is legally, ethically, and morally wrong. So we have option 2, which would be for Mr. Sample to conduct a thorough investigation to figure out all of the details of the situation. Exactly how many copies were made, the names of the teachers it was distributed to, how many teachers used the copies, if the students use the copies, etc. Gathering these details would help Mr. Sample in determining his first step about consequences and steps for action. After all the details are gathered, he could also refer to the school, district, or school's policies on copyright, if there are any such policies, and he may want to consult with his superiors to discuss the situation and actions for next steps. In this situation, it would probably be a good idea for some action to be taken against Mrs. Lynn. Now, the extent of this action could be up to Mr. Sample and also his superiors. This could include just a simple meeting to discuss the situation, a write-up, or a mandatory training, or even maybe a suspension of some kind for Mrs. Lynn. In addition, the stakeholders who are involved should also receive follow-up training about copyright and their responsibilities. Mr. Sample should document who received this training, and then follow-up training should be provided as needed, and copyright materials and reminders should be posted in common areas of the school. The school board should really reflect on their policies and update them if needed to reflect copyright and implement an acceptable use policy. Some additional options. Mr. Sample could conduct an investigation just to document everything. It's always good to have documentation of any incident that occurs. He could follow up with Mrs. Lynn to make sure that she followed his instructions. And then Mr. Sample could implement training on copyright for all staff. And then the staff would have to sign a contract to state their understanding. Copyright law and infringement policies could be posted throughout the building to also heighten awareness. Another additional option would be for Mr. Sample to document the situation and then him to make plans for future training on copyright to all staff members. So let's evaluate our pros and cons of each of the different options. For option one of the pros is, for now, there's little disruption to the stakeholders involved. Some of the cons, this option could still have a negative impact on the stakeholders because they're still at risk for future consequences. And in this one, there's no training to be provided to prevent future infringement, and it's legally, morally, and ethically wrong to just kind of let it go. Option two, if some of the pros would be, there's a thorough investigation, disciplinary action could be taken, training would be provided to prevent future infringement, the legal, moral, and ethical standards are followed, and district policies would be assessed. The cons would be, this could pose a negative disruption to some of the stakeholders involved. Option three, the pros would be, investigation and documentation is done, there's follow-through, training is provided, and Mr. Sample takes action to prevent future infringement. The con would be, nothing is done at the district level to prevent future infringement. In the last option, documentation is done, and Mr. Sample is taking action to prevent future infringement. The cons would be, nothing is done to ensure that the software has stopped being used or additional copies are being made, and nothing is done at the district level to prevent future infringement. So in my opinion, I believe the best option would be option number two. And as a principal, I would want to make sure that I took the situation seriously and the necessary steps in order to protect all the stakeholders involved. Now, I understand that this option may cause some disruption in terms of disciplinary action to Mrs. Lynn, but it would protect the other stakeholders who could be affected by her actions. Failure to report and follow through could result in bigger problems for all the stakeholders and future infringement. So in order to prevent this, it would be important for the district to make sure that their policies reflect copyright law and that consequences should it not be followed. All stakeholders should receive training on copyright, and an acceptable use policy should be implemented. Copyright information materials should be posted in common areas to avoid future infringement. So the following slides outline the course of action. Now, Mrs. Lynn may be unhappy with this course of action, and Mr. Sample could be met with some resistance. But Mrs. Lynn thinks her reasoning is that she's helping out the schools and the students by stretching the money in the budget. She's not thinking of the consequences that will come about because they are a small school in a rural area. So it would be important for Mr. Sample to communicate his reasoning and actions clearly, and his decisions are being made in order to protect everyone from more serious consequences in the future. So here's the plan of action. Conduct an investigation, interview all the stakeholders, document. Then Mr. Sample could plan steps for action. He can refer to the school district's board policies and procedures. He could then discuss the disciplinary action with Mrs. Lynn and explain reasoning for action. and then create an action plan to collect the copies and stop future copies from being made. He could also